Hello and peace, everyone. This is our first podcast for IFRS Masterclass, and in each session, we are planning to go into depth into one specific component or one specific area of a particular standard. So that's our plan for now. Just to intimate you in advance, this is my first podcast on this particular tool that I'm using, and so there might be some glitches, and I might find I might take some time in trying to figure out how to navigate different screens and different modes. So I hope you bear with me. And so perfect. Let me just also try to open my YouTube channel and try to see if the podcast appears here as well. All right, sounds great. Let me try to share my screen. I hope it's right here. Okay, so if I just zoom it in completely. Okay, it doesn't work like that. So apparently I have to go with this particular view. Okay, I would have wanted my video to be coming on the one third part here, but apparently it doesn't work like that. So unfortunately, so let's start with this particular view that we have here. Okay, so today we're going to talk about in depth about what control is under IFRS 16 and how to identify a lease, because a lot of contracts can have terms that look like lease, but they somehow you know do not meet the criteria for identifying a lease. So we'll go a bit deep into this area today, and so our podcast will generally be conversational. You will be able to see um, different examples in depth and different scenarios for very specific these cases in a particular standard. So today we're talking about how to identify a lease and how to determine control, or right to control and identify an asset. So for this particular podcast, we'll go into detail of what right to control is, what an identified asset is, and a lot of these things. Let me also start my camera here so that I can also use it later on for better videos. All right, so let's get started with identifying lease. So a contract, and whether when you're identifying whether the contract contains a lease or not, you have to see whether you have a right to control the identified asset. And when we talk about the right to control, there are two main components of this assessment. First is the right to use substantially all of the economic benefits from the asset, and we'll talk about it in depth, and the right to direct the use of that asset. So if I'm using a particular asset, I can drive all the benefits from it, and I can decide how to use that asset. So, for example, if I have leased a machinery, I can decide um, how to use that asset. For example, if I want to produce, um, a pen with it, or I want to produce mice with it. So it's all my choice, and I can drive all the economic benefits from that particular asset for the given the lease term. And so there are certain edge cases we will also talk about. For example, if the control lasts for a fraction of a contract duration. So, for example, if I can use an asset for 10 years, but I have the right to all the economic benefits during the first 3 years. But after the first 3 years, during the next 7 years, even though I would be using that asset on and off, I would not have the right to use substantially all the economic benefits. And in that case, I would not have control for the next 7 years, but for the first 3 years, I would have that control. Similarly, if the customer is a joint venture, the problem arises if there are two companies that are forming a joint venture. None of them, and that joint venture obtained an asset on lease. None of those individual companies have the right to control the asset without the permission of the other company, which means they have a joint control. And so we'll talk about that scenario as well. And the contract contains multiple separate components. So if there are more than one components, how do we deal with the entire lease contract? Do we identify as a lease or not? So there are two-part tests that we talked about just now, the economic benefits and directing the use. And so here's a quick example. If you sign a contract for a specific printing press, you keep 100% of the output and revenue from the books it prints, and you decide exactly which books it prints and when it runs, which condition B. So condition A is you can generate all the output and keep all the revenue, basically all the benefits. And condition B is fulfilled if you can decide how many books to print, which book to publish, and all that. And if both these conditions exist, you have the right to control that asset. Now, as we initially talked about an example, if we have a partial term lease, for example, the contract spans several years. I can use that asset for several years, but I only have an exclusive control of that asset for a specific portion of the time. For example, if there's a particular vehicle I want to lease out, I have the right to use that vehicle exclusively for the first 3 years, and after that, for the next 7 years, I would have the partial access to that vehicle, and someone else would also be using it half the time. In that particular case, it would be considered that for the next 7 years, I will not have the right of use, and for the first 3 years, I will have the right to use an asset. So as we just discussed, in these cases, the contract still contains lease, but only for the specific time frame where the control exists. So you don't dismiss the lease just because it doesn't cover the entire lifetime of the master contract. So we're not just talking about the span of the master contract. We're talking about any component of that could fit in the definition of lease, and that could be defined as a lease term for that particular lease. So if a company signs a 10-year facility management contract, for the first 3 years, the company has exclusive uses and control over a specialized backup generator. The contract contains a lease for that generator, but only for a 3-year term. So even though we had a 10-year contract, but only for the first 3 years did we have the right to exclusively use that asset. And so therefore, the lease term is 3 years, and for that, we have the control of the lease. Let's talk about joint arrangements. Under joint arrangements, multiple companies team up under a joint arrangement, and so they may sign a contract together. And when figuring it out, if a lease exists, you treat the joint arrangement itself as a single contract. So there are no two separate contracts. There are no, even though there are two separate parties, and even if one particular party might be using that asset and the other might be signing it, because there's joint control and a joint agreement, this might still be a lease. So you have to look at whether the joint entity as a whole has control over the asset rather than evaluating the individual companies separately. So company A and company B form a joint venture to build a bridge. The JV signs a contract for exclusive use of a massive crane, right? So the JV includes both the companies A and companies B, and they have jointly signed the contract to use a massive crane. Now, even if company A operates it and company B pays for it, it doesn't matter because the joint entity has signed it, and the JV or the joint venture collectively controls the crane, and therefore the joint venture has a lease. Now let's talk about separate lease components. This is another edge case. So a single contract might contain multiple different leases or a mix of leased assets and general services. So some components might be services, some component might be asset, and some component might be leases. And so you not look at one particular component and decide the fate of the rest of the components. You have to look at each component separately and decide whether it is a lease or not, whether the right to control exists under IFRS 16 or not. So you must evaluate each potential asset on its own merit to see if it qualifies as a lease. So this rule prevents companies from buying a clear I'm sorry. This rule prevents companies from burying a clear lease inside a massive service component to avoid reporting it on the balance sheet. So let's say you have a massive service agreement, which have via which we are obtaining a lot of maintenance services, a lot of operating services, which means your company, your machinery is being operated, your factory is being maintained. And within that contract, you might have certain asset to which you are obtaining a right to use and you're obtaining control over that. And so if that is the case, you cannot bury that right of use inside the service agreement. You have to identify those components where you have the right to control those assets. So here's a simple example. You rent an excavator, a bulldozer, and a daily maintenance crew. You look at the excavator, which is a component one, and the bulldozer, which is component two, individually to see if you control them. So, for example, as excavator is used entirely by the supplier, and you have no right to control it, and the only service you're buying is the excavation of the land by that machine, and you do have no right to control that land. Then component one does not contain a lease. The bulldozer, on the other hand, if you have the right to control it and use it for whatever purpose you want, in that case, component two is a lease. And let's take component three is a maintenance crew, and that would automatically be a service and not a lease. So this is a brief introduction of the control aspects, whether the lessee controls an asset or not. Now we go into individual components of identifying a lease. So first, let's go into um, what are substantially all the economic benefits. We talked about two criteria, right? We talked about substantially all of the economic benefits must be obtained by the lessee, and the lessee should have the right to control the use. So we discussed some of the edge cases about both of these things. Now let's talk about specifically um, what does it mean when a lessee has substantially all the economic benefits for that asset. So let me try to see if I'm sharing the right screen now. All right. Perfect. So I hope you can see my screen. Give me a second. Let me also try to make sure that the event is live on LinkedIn as well. Sounds great. If I just go to the event, can I see? All right, sounds great. So let's move towards the next slide, which is what does it mean for a lessee to have substantially all of the economic benefits, which is also part of control. So to control an asset in a lease context, a customer must have the right to obtain substantially all of the economic benefits from its use during the specified period. The right is evaluated based on the defined scope of the contract. So, for example, paying a portion of the proceeds back to the supplier does not negate this control. So we'll see what does it mean to obtain substantially all of the economic benefits. But it's important to understand that those benefits will be assessed based on the defined scope of the contract. So let's define more clearly what substantially all means, right? So a customer must be able to claim nearly all the value generated by the asset during the lease term. This can be achieved through the direct use, which means operating it, holding it for strategic reasons, or subleasing it to another party. So if I can obtain a benefit from a particular office by subleasing it, I can still obtain the benefits or substantially all the benefits from it. If I can obtain the benefits from a particular office by using it and residing in it, then I can obtain substantial benefits by substantially all benefits by using it, right? So it depends on what the purpose of use is. So what counts as a benefit? It includes primary outputs, which means products made, byproducts, scrap metal waste, and potential cash flows from commercial transactions with third parties. So I can even use it for myself. I can produce output from it, or I can even give it to someone else for use and obtain benefit from it. But any restriction on any use does not negate substantially all the requirement. Those because certain restrictions can limit the scope of how I can use it, and substantially all requirement is basically assessed after determining that scope, right? So we'll talk about it in more detail. Here's a quick example. A logistic company leases a cargo ship exclusively for 3 years. Even if the ship sits idle in port for 6 months, the company still has the right to all economic benefits because no one else can use it to move freight during that time. So even if I'm not using something, but I have the right to use it, that substantially all requirement is still fulfilled, even though I'm not using it, right? Simply because the substantially all requirements about the right to control the asset, and so the right to use it, and not about whether I use it or not. The second thing that we talked about is scope-based assessment. So even though there might be some limitations to scope, and if there are any, we would have to assess whether all benefits accrue to the lessee based on that scope. So the benefits are measured only within the specific boundaries set by the contract. So what kind of limits can be there? If a contract limits whether or how much an asset is used, you don't look at the potential benefits outside those limits. So you're not looking at what the asset can maximally produce and what I'm producing inside of what to what extent I have the right to produce or to what extent I have the right to benefit from it. Rather, we have to see to what extent the contract has scoped my access to that, my benefits from that asset, and from within the contract scope, how much am I able to utilize it. So there could be territory limits. For example, uh, uh, I can drive a particular vehicle or particular fleet inside a particular location and not outside that. I can use it in Karachi or New York and not in Dhaka. Benefits are evaluated based solely on a large geography, right? So if I have a transport vessel, I can only take it on certain routes. That those are limits, which are which we say are scope based boundaries. And there could be usage limits. There could be, for example, if you have a vehicle, you may be allowed to drive it up to a certain mileage per month. That could be a limit. That could be a valid limit, and it could still be a lease. So whatever benefits we are assessing within the defined scope. Here's a quick example again. You lease a medical laser in limited to use in New York, right? So if a particular device is only limited to use in New York, you know the potential revenue it could have made in California. You only check if you get all the revenue produces while in New York. So if, for example, you have an asset, you can use it at multiple locations, and the potential benefit of using it in all those locations is much more than using it in a particular location. But the contract limits the use to that particular location. Then you would have to see whether you have the right to obtain substantially all the economic benefits from that asset in that location. So the relativity would be between what benefits you can obtain from the asset as compared to the total benefits available or you want to obtain from the asset in that particular location and not anywhere. And another very important point is that if, for example, I am using a particular machinery, let's say it's an ice cream bar, or maybe it's a coffee machine, and I'm remitting a percentage of the revenue to the owner in addition to a rent, then an argument can be made that I'm not obtaining the entirely, substantially all the economic benefit because I'm sharing my economic benefits. But revenue sharing as a consideration, it does not negate the substantially all benefits requirement. So if a customer has to pay a cut of their earnings, like a percentage of sales to a supplier as rent, the money is still considered on an economic benefit obtained by the customer. So just because I'm sharing that revenue does not mean I have not obtained a benefit. That's true that I'm paying that benefit forward as a rent, and so that can be a legit requirement under IFRS 16. So um, let's say they simply use a portion of their earned benefit to pay for the right to use the asset. It does not negate their control, right? Here's a good example. A coffee shop leases a small kiosk. The agreement requires $2,000 per month, but plus 5% of all that is sales. So just like the coffee example I gave you, it's a small kiosk and the coffee shop has leased it out and their monthly rent is $2,000, and they're also entitled to 5% of all live sales. So even though 5% goes to the landlord, uh, or the owner, the shop is still considered to have the right to substantially all benefits because it earned that revenue through its exclusive use of the space, right? And so now we will come. So far, it seems like all these conditions are met in any case, right? But there would be a case where we would understand where the boundary ends and where it stops being the right to use or right to control the assets. So where the limit where we would say that this is no, the lessee no more has the right to control the asset. We will see it at the end of this podcast when we come to those scenarios. All right, let me just move to the next segment now. All right, so now let's talk about what does it mean for a lessee to have the right to direct the use of an asset. So in the previous section we talked about, in the previous segment we talked about what does it mean to have access to substantially all of the economic benefits of the asset. Now we'll talk about what does it mean to have the right to direct the use of the asset. A customer has the right to direct the use an asset's use if they meet one of the two main criteria. Either there should be an active control, which means the lessee can direct the use however it likes. So they would have an ongoing right to decide how and for what purpose an asset is used, or they could have a predetermined control. For example, in the contract they determined how and why they wanted to use the asset, and that was logged in advance. So the customer must either operate the asset themselves or have it designed for that purpose. And if that is the case, we would still consider that the lessee has the right to direct the use of that asset. So let's look at what active control really means. So this is what normal standard leases look like. The customer has the day-to-day authority to change their mind about what the asset is doing, where it goes, and what it produces throughout the contract term. So if you're leasing a vehicle, you can decide what road to rent on, what to carry on it, for what purpose to use it. The focus here is on ongoing decision-making power. If the customer can change the output or the asset's function at will, they have the active control. Now, a logistics company leases an airplane. The company has active control because it decides every day which cities the plane flies to, whether it carries passengers or freight, and when it stays grounded. So a logistics company can have the right to control the asset if it can decide what to do with it. Even though, as we learned earlier, there could be scope restrictions as to in which routes the plane can fly, it will still decide what to carry on it or not, for example. But as we discuss in the future, there might be more protective restrictions. For example, they cannot carry explosive on the plane. That would not negate the right to control the asset because they can still control it within very broad protective restrictions on it. Now, there could be two kinds of predetermined control. One could be via operations and one could be via design. So let's look at operations part first. So sometimes the nature of the asset or contract means that how and for what purpose the asset is used is actually agreed upon upfront and cannot be changed, as we decided earlier. Now, in these cases, the customer still directs the use if they have the exclusive right to operate the asset, and the supplier cannot override their open instructions. So let's say it's a very complex machinery, and they decided that because they would use it to produce a particular kind of gadget, let's say, and they are using it as they like to produce that particular gadget. So this applies heavily to assets with a single dedicated function where active decision making isn't really possible once the asset is turned on. So let's say it's a particular furnace that's used to dissolve a particular kind of metals to produce combustion engines, let's say. So that furnace can be used once they've started. It would be used for that particular purpose, and so the operational control is with lessee, and therefore the lessee has the control. Here is another example. A company leases a solar farm, and the how and why are predetermined, which is generating electricity. However, the company has the right to operate the farm. How does it have the right to operate the farm? It can maintain the farm, it can control the systems, and the supplier cannot override this. The supplier cannot override how the lessee can want to place the farm, how lessee want to place the individual solar panels, how the lessee wants to design the entire solar structure, how and when the lessee wants to produce it. All of these things can be determined by the lessee, and therefore the lessee has the control to use the asset, even though it's a predetermined control, because the solar panels are nevertheless being used to generate electricity. And there could also be a predetermined control via design, which means the lessee has determined how the asset would be designed because the lessee wanted to use it in a particular way. And in this case, even if the asset is being operated by the supplier, uh, even even if the asset is day to day being operated by the supplier, the decision of how it's being used is fundamentally with the lessee, because lessee has determined how the asset would be designed and how it would function, and if it's so narrow in its function, it is eventually being used for the lessee under its control. So the logic is that the customer made all the relevant decisions about how and why the asset would be used before the period of use even began by engineering it to exact specifications. So a pharma company designs a highly customized chemical mixing machine to produce a potential drug, let's say. A supplier builds and owns it, right? The supplier has built the machine, the supplier owns it, and let's say the supplier also operates it. But because it's a very specific chemical mixing machine that can only do the work that the customer wants, that the lessee wants. So even if the supplier pushes the buttons, the pharma company directs the use because their unique design predetermined its operations. And so we would say that this was a predetermined control of the lessee by design. So what we have talked about is there could be an active control, which is controlled by using that asset actively. There could be a predetermined control via operations, which means the purpose of the asset could have been determined by the contract, and the lessee might be operating that asset the way he wants. And there could also be a predetermined control via design, which means the lessee went a step back and decided how the asset would be designed based on how the lessee wants to use it. And so that could also be a way of having right to control over the leased assets. Let's go a bit deeper on one more topic, which is basically the purpose of use. For what purpose the asset can be used and how and why. So let's talk about it right now. So let me try to share my screen again in a way that All right. So let's dive a bit deeper into for what purpose the asset is used and how do we define whether lessee controls that purpose of use or not. So a customer can direct how and for what purpose an asset is used if they control the key decisions that impact the economic benefits generated by the asset. So what are those key decisions? This generally means having the power to change the type, timing, location, and quantity of the assets produced. So a customer can decide what to produce, when to produce, where to produce, and how much to produce. Um, However, simply having the right to operate or maintain the asset is usually not enough to meet the criteria, as those are secondary to deciding the asset's actual purpose. So if you have that asset and you can operate it and you can maintain it, that's not enough because you need to be able to decide. So initially when we're talking about the right of control and right of obtaining substantially all the benefits, any restriction the lessor was applying on the lessee, it seemed like all of those still meant the definition of the lease and definition of the right of control. But now we are trying to talk about a scenario where, let's say, in the actual functioning of that asset, if in substance, what the lessee wants to produce from it, if it does not have the control to determine the timing, type, and location and quantity of that, uh, then there's a problem in the right to control the asset. So let's talk a bit deeper about the relevant decision-making rights, okay? To control the asset's purpose, the customers must hold the right that actually matter, the ones that directly affect how much economic benefit is squeezed out of the asset. The customer must be able to change these decisions dynamically throughout the period of use within the agreed upon boundaries of the contract. So when we talk about the agreed upon boundaries of the product, the contract, we we talked about the predetermined purpose of the contract, which means it could be defined by the contract. We talked about the predetermined design of the contract. That could be a problem. That could be predetermined by the contract, but still, the lessee could have the right to control. We could have usage restrictions as to how many hours, how many mileage, and how many uh, and to what in what location would it be used. But when we are talking about these relevant decision-making rights, we're talking within that scope. So, for example, if the contract restricted that the asset would only be used in New York or Karachi, we'll only have to look at uh, whether the lessee have the right to use anywhere he wants within that particular city, or if uh, the right to use a particular vehicle was to use it for, let's say, 10,000 miles per week, um, then we would have to see uh, whether the lessee has the right to use the asset to whatever extent it wants up to that mileage. So if the lessee wants, he can use it for 5,000 miles. If the lessee wants, he can use it for 7,500 miles and any particular amount of miles. So when we're talking about these relevant decision-making rights, we're talking about them within the scope of the contract. We're talking about within the predetermined purpose, or we're talking about the within the predetermined design of that particular contract. So what counts as relevant decision changes depending on the asset. For a truck, it might be the destination. For a factory, it might be the product being manufactured. So it's the relevant decision might be based on what the asset is. So you lease a plot of commercial land and you have the relevant decision-making rights that you can choose to use the land to host a farmer's market in the summer, use it for paid parking in the winter, or leave it empty. So if you have a plot of land, you can use it for a veggie market, you can use it for parking, whatever purpose. Within the scope of the contract, whatever purpose there that's legal, you should be able to use it. Otherwise, you don't have the right to control it. So what we're talking about right now is the output control. And so I should have the right to decide what to produce, when to produce, where to produce, and whether I want to produce it or not, or to what quantity I want to produce. But all these rights are determined within the scope of the contract, to remind you. So here is a quick example. A company directs its use of a 3D printer because they decide what it prints. For example, it could print, let's say, toys or maybe devices. When it runs, for example, it could be running on a day shift or night shift. Where it operates, um, it could be operating on floor one, floor two, floor three. So within the scope, they would have the leverage, and whether and how much it prints running at 100% capacity versus shutting down. So, and that 100% capacity would be based on, again, the scope of the contract. If the you know, let's say the filaments of that particular 3D printer are limited in use, you would have to decide how much to use those filaments within that predetermined limit. And so it's important to understand that operating or maintaining a particular asset is different from directing its purpose or directing the use of the asset. So just because someone pushes the button to run a machine or changes the oil to keep it running does not mean they're deciding how and for what purpose it's used. It could be both ways, by the way. If a lessor is operating and maintaining the asset, but it's being used at the desire and will of the lessee, then even though operation and maintenance is in the hands of lessor, the lessee is deciding whether and for what purpose the leased asset should be used. On the other hand, if the lessee is operating and maintaining the asset, but the lessor controls it, the lessor can stop it at any time it wants, uh, then the lessee does not have the right to use it. So operating and maintaining are generally subordinate tasks that follow the main purpose. So, but here's an exception. If the asset's purpose is entirely predetermined, as we talked about, but in an active decision-making scenario, an operator or maintenance worker is just fulfilling the purpose decided by someone else. So operator and operations, operating an asset or maintaining an asset does not determine it's not a decisive criteria as to who has the control. Again, a very quick example: a shipping company leases a cargo vessel with the crew provided by the owner. Right, so the entire cargo vessel has been provided with the crew. The shipping company is still directs the use because they decide what cargo goes on the ship and which port it sails to. The crew is there, and the crew is the staff of the owner, but the crew is only operating the ship to fulfill that purpose. It's not controlling whether and for what purpose the vessel should be used, and therefore the lessee or the shipping company has the right to use the asset, not the um, crew, the owner, right? And so this is a brief description of the right to control the asset. Let's move to the next segment. Okay, a bit more about predetermined use cases and protective restrictions. Let's quickly move on to the timing of decision. Uh, to have the right to direct an asset, a customer must generally have the power to make decisions while they are using it. If the customer only decides or dictates what they want the asset to produce before the contract starts, and has no say afterwards. They are just buyer of the goods and services. This is a very important critical point. So even though we had predetermined for what purpose the asset would be used, but within that purpose there should be a leverage of, for example, if there's a particular pen that I want to produce, I can have 10 varieties of those pens, 10 varieties of markers. I can produce something else of plastic. So even though the machine had a particular purpose, let's say to produce, like say, plastic objects, within those objects, I should have the right to decide what to produce. Otherwise, what I'm doing is I'm really buying the goods or services that I want to produce. And the only exception to this rule is the design exception. For example, if the asset was designed so specifically for my purpose that even though I'm producing only one particular thing, I do not have any flexibility as to what I produce from it. But because I designed it, I pretty much designed the asset, therefore I now have the right to use that asset. But let's say the asset could actually produce few more things. If let's say the asset had 4 different purposes, and the contract scoped into one, and within that one purpose, I could produce 10 different kinds of things, and I'm only able to produce one thing because that was predetermined by the contract. In that case, I do not have a contract to right to use the asset. I have basically contract to get those service goods produced. That might be a service contract, or that might be the purchase of products. So just to clarify that point, here's a quick example. A clothing retailer signs a contract with the factory, specifying the exact design, fabric, and quantity of 10,000 shirts to be produced next month. Because the retailer only specified the output before production and has no decision-making rights over the machinery during production, this is a purchase agreement and not a lease, right? So if the machinery was not specialized and the output was very specialized, and I cannot, as a lessee, change that output, then I do not have the right to control the asset. Now, there could be some protective rights which would not violate the right of control requirements, and it is very normal for suppliers to have these kind of protective rights. So let's say there's a multi-million-dollar asset, and the lessor or the owner wants to protect it and ensure that it's safe. So these protective rights just set the parameters, which means the sandbox or scope, as we talked about earlier. As long as the customer calls the short inside that sandbox, they still correct the use. So what kind of protection rights there could be? There could be usage protection rights we talked about. There could be demographic boundaries that we talked about. There could be operating policies boundaries, and there could be illegal uses or hazardous uses which I'm restricted for using it. Let's simply look at this example, which is clarified completely. A logistics company leases delivery trucks, so there could be some protective restrictions on how those delivery trucks can be used. Now look at this. The supplier states the trucks cannot be driven outside the country, must not exceed 60,000 miles per year, and cannot transport explosives. So if a particular truck cannot transport explosives, that does not mean that the lessee does not have the right to use the truck to transport anything he wants, as long as he remains within that limit of safety and precaution. And so, despite these heavy restrictions, the logistic company directs the use because they decide the daily routes, the standard cargo, within those safe legal boundaries. So that was it about the control of the asset. Now let's just also talk about what does it mean to have an identified asset. So let's look at the next section, which is about what does it mean to have an identified asset? Because the entire thing was the right to control an identified asset, and within that identified asset, we talked about how we should have the right to substantially all the benefits, and we should have the right to control the asset. But what exactly is the identified asset? Okay, just to give a preamble, to have a lease, a contract must relate to an identified asset. An asset is identified if it's explicitly written into the contract or implicitly provided, which means the identification of the asset could be like down to a particular serial number, or it can be referred by its function. However, an asset is not considered identified if the supplier has a substantial right to substitute it. So this is the, again, another definition killer, another loophole in the definition. For example, if there is a substantial right to substitute it, then anything in the definition, even if it's met, it's not a lease. So what does it mean? It means that they have both the practical ability and the financial incentive to swap it out at any time. So the lessor can exchange that asset for any other asset, and if that's the case, then that's not a lease. If the lessor can do it during the lease term. Furthermore, a portion of a larger asset only counts as an identified asset if it is physically distinct or represents almost the entire capacity of the whole asset. So if you're talking about a particular portion of an asset, let's say it's not an entire airplane, but let's say it's a separate engine. And so if that jet engine is physically distinct and represents the entire capacity of the whole of that particular engine itself, then it can maybe lease separately. So let's dive a bit deeper into explicit versus implicit identification. So an asset doesn't necessarily need a serial number written on the contract to be identified, of course. It can be explicitly named, or it can be implicitly identified if it's only an asset that supplier has available to fulfill their promise to you. The key is that a specific physical item is being dedicated to use. So if you know which particular asset is being dedicated to use, you know that. If, for example, you say that you have the right to lease a particular truck, and the company has, let's say, 20 trucks, and the right to use a truck, which means automatically gives the lessor the substitution right, because the truck is not identified, because the lessor has 10 different trucks. And if the lessor wants, he can change it and still give you the truck, and contractually he would be fine because he had given you the right to use one truck that he owns, right? There might be some specifications. The truck would be in working condition. He should have that kind of mileage. He should have that kind of engine capacity. But even within those conditions, there might be 2 or 3, 4 trucks that he have, and he might be able to change it. And if he's able to substitute it, then the asset is not identified, and therefore he does not have a lease. So here are quick examples of how a particular asset can be identified either explicitly or implicitly. Explicitly, a contract sales states that you are leasing a delivery van with the particular number. Implicitly, you sign a contract for the use of a specialized crane. The contract doesn't state a serial number, but the supplier only owns one crane of that type. So it's understood that you are leasing that particular crane, and therefore the lessor cannot substitute it. Now, what are our substantive substitution rights? This is the biggest hurdle in identifying an asset. Even if an asset is named, even if it's serially numbered, it is not an identified asset if the supplier can freely swap it out. So the supplier must have the practical ability to swap it whatever they want for this particular substitution right for the lessor to exist. And they must benefit economically from doing so. The profit of swapping must outweigh the cost. And so if they have the economic reasons to do that, and if they have the practical ability to do that, then the lessor has a substitution right. If an asset is located at your premises, the cost to swap it usually kills the economic benefits, making the substitution right non-substantive. So let's say, for example, there's a plant that is implanted or that's installed in your factory, and to take off that plant and deinstall that plant and to install somewhere else would be economically not viable for any lessor. In that case, even though the plant was not properly identified, even though the plant was vaguely defined, and the lessor kind of had the right to swap it if he wanted. He still does not have the substantive right because it would be economically not feasible for him. So here's a quick example. You contract for a standard shipping container. The supplier has thousands of these containers at their disposal, and they frequently swap them to optimize logistics, saving money. Because they can easily swap it and profit from doing so, the right is substantive. Result, you have a freight service and not lease. So if you have um, uh, any object from a lessor that lessor can easily swap, then you do not have a lease. You have a particular service to use or asset, but that's not defined or under IFRS 16 as a lease contract. Okay, now you have to further evaluate whether those substitution rights exist or not. So you evaluate the substitution rights based on the facts at the start of the contract. So you must ignore highly unlikely future scenarios like uninvented technology. So if a supplier swaps an asset because it's broken, needs maintenance, or gets a technical update, this does not count as substantive substitution right. So if, for example, a lessor gives you the protection that if the asset gets damaged and substituted, then it's basically the right to control that asset is with the lessee still, because the lessee is allowing the asset to be substituted, and therefore, even though there's such protection in the contract, it's not a substantive right to substitution because it's not economically beneficial for the lessor to substitute it. Rather, it's economically worse for the lessor, but because the lessee needs it and the lessee is allowing it, therefore, such clause can exist, and the substitution right still does not exist. But here's the key thing: if it's too difficult to figure out the supplier substitution right is substantive or not, the rules require that you assume it's not. Right? It's the feel of the standard. And another quick example for you: you lease a fleet of company cars. The contract states that the supplier will replace any car that breaks down or needs major engine repair. Now, that's a protection that you have as a lessee, and therefore it's not the right to control is not with the lessor because you're allowing him to repair the cars or exchange the cars that are damaged. So it's more of a warranty or repair clause and not a substantive substitution right. The cars are identified asset and your lease is a valid lease. Now, what happens when you lease out certain portions of assets, just like we talked about a particular engine of a particular vehicle or an airplane? So, technically, you do not have to lease a whole asset for it to be an identified asset. You can lease a portion of it. However, to be identified asset, that portion must be physically distinct. Now, this is a very critical criteria here. If it's not physically distinct, like a percentage of capacity, it is not an identified asset unless you are taking substantially all that capacity. So when we're talking about limiting, for example, the mileage of the vehicle, we said that the contract can limit the scope of how much mileage of a particular vehicle can the lessee use. But the key was that lessee is not entitled to, let's say, 10%, 20%, 50%, or 70% of the mileage, and 30% is given to someone else, or 30% can be used by the owner. That is not how a lease works. Substantially, all the rights, all the economic benefits of that asset should be used, should be utilized by the lessee, even though there are mileage limits to maintain the performance of the asset, for example. However, if the asset is shared between two individuals or the usage is shared between two individuals, you cannot say that it is an identified asset, and therefore, in those cases, it would not be a valid lease. So, to put it very straightforward, this rule prevents companies from calling a 5% share of a pipeline lease. So, if you can use 5% of a particular thing, or 10% of a particular thing, or even 80% of a particular thing, and the 20% is shared by someone else, then you do not have the right to control that asset. You do not have the right to obtain substantially all the benefits from that asset because you are sharing that asset with someone else. So you lease. So when would that asset be physically distinct, and when would that not be distinct? So when you lease an entire third floor of a 10-story office building, this is an identified asset. Even if you rent a particular room in a particular floor, that could still be an identified asset. But if you say that you have signed a contract for 10% of the data storage capacity on a cloud server, this is not a lease because you cannot physically separate your 10%. This is a service. Similarly, if you say that I can have 10% of the chairs in this particular office, I can occupy 10% of the chairs in this office, and you can substitute what chairs they are. This is not an identified leases, and therefore you don't have the right to control any particular identified asset, and therefore it's not a valid lease. So I hope today was a rich session on the control of assets and what makes a valid lease. So if you have been following this session since the start or for a very long time, you will realize that these sessions are going to be some in-depth, deep dive into specific aspects of IFRS, various standards, in this particular case, IFRS 16. And so in each episode, we will announce a particular different topic, and within that topic would have different segments. And those segments would be deep dive into application materials of specific standards. And so I hope, I'm not expecting it to be a very popular series because I'm not expecting it to be, a quick refresher of IFRS 16 or quick refresher of IFRS 9. But the benefit of having this series is that if anyone is stuck in a particular standard or want a very specific application guidance for a particular area of IFRS, they can gain from it. Additionally, when I'm preparing these podcasts, I'm also preparing the supplementary material or accompanying material that I would also publish or post on my LinkedIn and different places over time. And so this would allow me to build deeper material for my audience who want specific application guidance for specific cases, and make my free resources even richer for my audience. So this is the vision behind these podcasts. I will see 2 or 3 podcasts and to look at how it works for me and how it works for my audience, and then eventually decide whether I want to continue with these sessions. If you have any particular suggestions about these podcasts or about this, how you want these sessions to be, do let me know. I know this was my first session. There might have been some technical glitches. I'm hoping that my redesign the format of the screen that you're seeing right now to make it more visible, more clearly visible, and aesthetically appealing as well. Anyways, I would also hope to take out some more clips from these podcasts and post it for your help, for your easy reference, so you can have each of these individual segments in probably smaller bite-sized videos on my YouTube channel and also on my LinkedIn. So stay in touch. Hopefully the next podcast will be the same time at 2 p.m. UA time next week on Wednesday. So thank you for joining, and do let me know your thoughts in the comments and in my DM. Thank you.